You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 508 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. There is a lot of news to cover on today's show. We are just living in crazy times where there are just so many very interesting things going on around the world. Very important conversations that could be had about so many issues. And yet you turn on the mainstream media and the talk of the day is the size of the crowd at Trump's rally. So I'll be covering the important stuff here on the show. So make sure you share it. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor there, and I write the daily news roundup and the show, and both of those are on the homepage. If you're really enjoying the show, think about donating to it at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I have on today's show is to talk about police body cameras and the problems with it. Now, first of all, I do think there's a lot of good things about police body cameras. I think some of the footage we get from that actually does lead to convictions of police officers. And so I don't even know if they're on, total impact and net negative. Maybe the cops just wearing those, feeling, maybe they feel more responsible for their actions. And so maybe there's even those kind of situations. But there are still a lot of problems. The first being is this story that is from Reason, where you have a journalist in San Francisco, and this is during 2019, has his house raided. Before the raid, we now find out from officers they were actually instructed by their superiors to turn off their body camera. I guess the purpose of this, they're raiding a journalist's home in an attempt to find some kind of link to who potentially leaked embarrassing information about a police chief. Maybe this was even, more or less a legal search. I mean, you can't always, drop personal information about people. But at the same time that, cops telling the officers not to have those body cameras on, especially for a search that is so important, like, the search of a journalist's home. Just, when you think of the first, amendment implications, not that we're, not all technically provided, those, we are all in effect the press. Like, anybody should be able to go out and publish essentially what they want, as long as it's not slander. I don't think, you should be able to like steal somebody's information or secretly record them. Like, it'd be different, I guess, if somebody was, doing something illegal, like harming a child in any way, right? I don't need to go into more detail. People know what I'm talking about. That kind of thing, like you record that, then you make that's one thing. But like, guys got like a weird thing that him and his wife do, it's wrong to go in there and then leak that information. So I don't know exactly where this ranges, but the police told the cops not to wear the body cameras. I think that's, the most important thing, because it tells us that, the police really have the ability to control when these are on or off. And so when we think about deterring their actions or not, it seems unlikely to do that if they could just, not turn on their body cameras for interactions where they feel like they may want to do something that they don't have to account for later. We saw this in the killing that I talked about in the last episode of the show with Dave DeCamp. It was David McAtee, the Mr. Barbecue guy down there in Louisville, who was, just standing outside his restaurant one night when he got popped by the National Guard. Police didn't have their body cameras on. Now, this is one of the first times I've ever heard of a police officer. I don't know if the actual officers, but the police chief was fired for it. So, maybe there'll be a little bit more of a push to wear the body cameras now in that department or something. But overall, this is a place where cops really have a lot of control. The next point I want to make is I linked to this interview in the show notes page. It was the Useful Idiots podcast, Matt Taibbi and Katie Halper, and they were interviewing the guy who's challenging Nancy Pelosi in the Democrat primary for her Congress. This guy sounded pretty good, talked about, defunding the military and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, there will be some, progressive stuff in that interview that you're not going to love, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. One thing he talks about is how, we put cameras on all these police officers. Well, when we're talking about facial recognition and stuff like that coming out, this is going to give the surveillance state a huge reach into kind of all of our communities if all of our police officers now have body cameras on. And so this isn't something that necessarily has to be a bad thing. I think, work in people like Michael Bolden and Michael Meharry over at the 10th Amendment Center who are passing laws to ensure, we can't use facial recognition on this, or we can't just opt into programs like the Stingray stuff. All that is really important. So check out the 10th Amendment Center for some more details and specifics on what they're doing and how they're doing it. But they pass laws that say we can't facial recognition to the national database based on all the police body cameras. And in fact, I would imagine it would, if it becomes an issue and we find out that, this is happening on a large scale, I'm sure the 10th Amendment Center will be one of the places leading the charge, kind of making the point that, hey, we got to make sure that the body cameras aren't allowed to. I think the biggest thing I have against, the police cameras here is that it seems in almost all cases, police departments retain control over the video and how it. Now, I guess, the maybe one step away here, one step removed is it's, some other state employee, the state attorney general, some civilian appointee to the police department, but nevertheless, somebody within the criminal justice system, somebody who is the colleague of these officers, who relies on the testimony and the credibility of police officers to do their jobs, who believe in, the U.S. criminal justice system because they're a part of it. They dedicate their lives. These aren't people that are just gonna see all the flaws in it because this is what they do. A lot of people do that, which is very easy to overlook any kind of an unethical stuff going on because this is what you've dedicated your life to. Unfortunately, there's ends up putting so many behind bars. But we have this killing in Los Angeles, and I believe the young man's first name is Andreas. I can't remember his last. If you just search Andreas on Twitter, you'll definitely find out what's going on with him. But this was in LA. He was apparently a young, ambitious 18-year-old young man who was, working security outside of an auto body shop. I guess this is an area where they felt like there was some tagging going on. So, just having a young kid out there say, hey, get lost and stuff like that is probably enough to run, most people off. And I guess he was out there and the manager says he was talking to some girls and the cops showed up and essentially just assumed that he was guilty of something and started chasing him. The manager has insisted time and time again the young man got on his knees and surrendered to these officers, and they just straight up executed him. But, this isn't body cam footage that the public gets their hands on right away. We could have answers, yesterday, 2 days ago. We could have answers tomorrow if they would just release the body cam footage. But it seems more like what happened. Police took all of the cameras and any kind of possible surveillance equipment and is hoarding it all. And so that allows them to control a very important part of the narrative. We've also seen cases where police will release selected parts of body cam footage. So maybe they'll show the part where a suspect is running away, but they don't show, the cop beating them before that. And so then, it looks like a more shoot or something like that. And people's attention span is pretty short, so they're not going to watch a 15 video. And to the people's fairness, the George Floyd video was hard to, I guess for those of you listening to this podcast, it's probably been not quite 8 minutes yet in the amount of time played. I'd shortened down some of the silences here, so I can't exactly tell. But let's say right here, we're between 8 and 9 minutes, right? You're listening to the podcast. This isn't even the amount of time it took you to get through that video of Floyd having, his neck knee on. So most of the time, people don't watch the whole thing. They watch a short clip, and if the police are able to release a short clip that makes it good, people are able to kind of be like, that's a good shoot and move on with their lives. And it's very unfortunate that these kind of things happen. So anyways, those are all my problems with body camera. One of the 3 police officers who fired their weapon at Breonna Taylor, this is the young woman who his name is memorialized in the no-knock raid bill that Rand Paul is putting forward, and what was the 26-year-old EMT who was killed very recently by police in Louisville, Kentucky. Plainclothes police officers kick down her door in the middle of the night. Her boyfriend thinks they're being robbed and goes to defend themselves and they light up this poor sleeping lady. And it's tragic. And, the fact that all three of these guys are in jail is absolutely unbelievable. But now one has been fired. So maybe the people of Louisville could sleep a little bit safer tonight that at least one of the murderers in their town doesn't have a badge and a gun. There were a couple big Supreme Court decisions recently. The Supreme Court blocked Trump's attempt to terminate the DACA program. This is what allows the Dreamers. It's pretty clear that the way Obama did this was unconstitutional and illegal. Now, people could debate their merits of it, and I am no slave to the U.S. Constitution. So, if you can argue with me and make the point that this was on net a benefit, I don't particularly see, the huge harm in having this program. But that said, by the rule of law and the way we all agreed to play this game, this thing was illegal. Nonetheless, the Trump administration, I guess, actually didn't do all the right legal paperwork to, get this thing ended. And so it actually turns out the Supreme Court rules that the DACA thing moves forward. And then I heard some people point out that, and I think that's some really astute political observation, that I don't think Trump will be able to end the Dreamer program before November, at least, and it's probably through the end of the coronavirus epidemic, just because it's such a big news story when people over international borders who either have or get coronavirus. In very disappointing Supreme Court news, they decided not to take up several cases dealing with qualified immunity. I'll link to an episode of the Scott Horton Show. He interviews Mike Meharry from the 10th Amendment Center, where he goes through and explains what qualified immunity is and how it allows cops to kill us and steal from us and get away with it. There's a new bill, and I think it's coming out of the House right now. Essentially, one of the goals, and I guess the main, thing that spurred the bill on right now, was Trump's decision to remove some troops from Germany, possibly even relocating them to Poland. But Congress is saying now that they want to pass a bill that will require the president to get approval from Congress before removing troops from Europe. I do think that this is unconstitutional. The president is the commander in chief and has the ability to move troops around so long as it isn't to start a war. And as I said before, I'm not going to just blindly obey the Constitution at every turn if I, think there's something morally wrong about it. But hell, this one works in our favor. And so I think we need to argue that the Constitution says, the Congress can't do this. And hopefully Trump will do what he's done on so many other foreign policy issues and veto this if it gets to his desk. The 2021 National Defense Authorization Act is being discussed and going through committee right now. So you guys know how this goes. It's been a few years I've been doing this on the show. I'll talk about it once or twice a week for the next couple months as different members of Congress try to get this bill or that bill. There's going to be some stuff that's horrific sounding that's very important. And then there's going to be some good stuff that could possibly get through and be really important. Like, last year they almost got something to prevent weapons sales to Saudi Arabia or to end the war in Yemen. So that, that's something that could happen this time around too. And certainly something worth keeping our eye on. The first thing I'm seeing out of this year's bill is it looks like it's a big boon to the Air Force, which is interesting because, we just got the Space Force, which is essentially a break off of the Air Force, but the Air Force is getting more planes than they're even asking for, the worthless F-35s. So it's a real disappointment to see that. And I'm sure that'll generally be the tone as I talk about the NDAA and the come. The State Department has approved a $600 million sale of Mark 6 patrol boats to Ukraine. They recently delivered $60 million worth of Javelin anti-tank missiles as well. This, of course, from the president who's constantly called Putin's public for, minor strategical change within Europe. But here he is emboldening Ukraine on the front closest and most important to Russia. So it's kind of absurd how this is able to be sold to the American people as, Trump is some kind of puppet of Vladimir Putin, yet every significant foreign policy step in his administration that has anything to do with Russia, it has taken the anti-Russia stand. I think there's a really interesting development here in the U.S. economic war that's essentially against the world at this point, and that we're adding our neighbors Mexico to the sanctions list. The president there, as I talked about recently, has signaled that he's willing to sell fuel to Venezuela, something that Trump seems to be easily convinced of. And I saw some notes of this in the Bolton book, although nobody give John Bolton money for this book. Scott links to a free copy out on the blog at the Libertarian Institute. So check that out. Definitely don't give him the money. And then even when you read it, you have to read it with the fact that, you know, this dude has taken every opportunity in his life possible to advance the likelihood of war. That's always what he tries to, kind of read anything that he's put out. That's his goal. And when somebody doesn't want war, it infuriates him. If there's an antichrist that walks to earth, it definitely seems to me that the guy would want a lot of war. So it's something he would at the very least have in common with John Bolton. I don't know if the Antichrist has a mustache. Had to talk to a priest about that. But anyways, getting to the point, hard to believe anything in there, but that Trump was easily, kind of talked out of any kind of detente with Iran or North Korea, kind of saying that the sanctions are about to work, you're going to get every one. And any attempt to go around or, lessen the sanctions, he was, able to be talked out of, and he took a hawkish approach towards because, his maximum pressure campaigns were about to work. So if Trump believes that and thinks that, Mexico is going to undermine that by giving them fuel, it could be a heavy sanctions campaign, and we'll see how it goes. I think, the leadership of that country now is at least pointing a little bit more in an independent direction, that they're not going to just look to appease the world emperor. The U.S. offered a $10 million reward for 2 members of the Colombian group FARC. There's kind of a shaky ceasefire still there between the government and the FARC, and, I don't want the U.S. to get involved in this thing. But it seems like they're going to do it. In some disappointing news, the Navy announced it will not reinstate Captain Brett Cozier as, the leader of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Captain Cozier was fired from his post after a letter that he wrote about his concern for his soldiers and being trapped on a ship with a spreading COVID outbreak leaked to the press. It ultimately got his ship to port where the sick men with COVID were able to get off. Ultimately, one person on his ship did die of COVID, but, maybe it could have been worse. Anyways, kind of as we see from this example, the U.S. doesn't actually care about the troops. If they would, probably would reinstate Captain Cozier if not, had not fired him in the first place. And that we're deploying more ships, now have 3 out in the Pacific in the middle of the COVID epidemic when America faces no real threat. There's a terror attack in the UK. 3 people were killed, 12 wounded. So far, I think the details that we essentially have is it was in reading a 25-year-old Libyan man used a knife. So some details are coming out about whatever happened between China and India. Some satellite photographs seems to show the Chinese essentially putting a tent somewhere in a demilitarized or kind of a no-go zone, and potentially Indian soldiers overreacted to this and, pretty harshly pushed the Chinese out of there, and then this led to a wider conflict. Again, it seems like the details of this are still very shaky, and we really haven't gotten any kind of official narratives out of either regime there. Estimates are now that China lost in total 40 soldiers during these clashes that apparently didn't involve gunfire. India lost about 20, and China had returned 12 captive Indian soldiers. Trump signed a bill that's going to require the U.S. sanction anybody in China labeled as a human rights abuser. Now, I don't really have a problem with Americans not wanting to do business with people in China who abuse human rights. I think, the labor conditions in China in some areas, I think, are abusive. I say that as somebody who, not in favor of minimum wages and I support capital purest form. But at the same time, China's a pretty repressive regime. And so you could really end up putting people in the position where they have no choice or an impoverished choice to work from this country that's a company that's then able, probably provide a lot of kickbacks to the state in order to get predatorily cheap labor. So, if you know that about a company, and I don't want to say any because I haven't done enough research. I've seen quite a few memes in the past couple saying like, hey, don't buy products from these companies because, they use this, slave what they call slave labor, but cheap labor in China. But at the same time, the U.S. doesn't need to be sanctioning people in China for this. Also, they're likely not going to go after the actual worst abusers, but people in the administration or in the CCP that the U.S. doesn't like. And the U.S. is dealing, quite frankly, with our own human rights abuses here at home. And again, I mean, if you don't believe me, just go on Twitter and search police abuse from even the past 2. You will just see a gross number of violations. And then if you really, want to subject yourself to something, there's 2 really good new documentaries on Netflix. One is How to Win a Drug War. That it's about, or maybe it's How to Fix a Drug Problem Crisis or something like that. It's about, in Massachusetts, there were these 2 women who were faking drug lab results, and it caused all kind of, crisis and fallout. And so it's really interesting. Injustice is unbelievable. Like, to describe it is difficult, and I think you'll get more out of it if you sit there and watch it. But just looking at the fact that, this one lady faked thousands of drug tests and was like on LSD and doing drug tests for people, and she serves less time in prison than the people who she faked drug test results for. It's shocking. And then the other one is the Innocence Project did a documentary with Netflix. The cases in there are absolutely astounding of how much injustice was done. And I think, realizing that this is just a tiny fraction of what we're able to capture and dedicate resources to expose, and that the whole situation is so much worse. And there's also a lot of essentially forced labor in U.S. prison where, people face punitive actions by the prison if they don't agree to these work contracts. And so, some company, maybe some telecommunications company or some factory that made some products will, make a deal with the prison. We'll give you a couple $1 million. You send us 100 guys, for this many hours. And, they perform these, mostly menial tasks. I think doing a lot of like actually phone banking and like customer service kind of calls and stuff like that now too. But the prison will only pay these guys like $1 an hour. And so the prisons are just making banking $1 an hour. I mean, that's not much better than slave labor, especially when, they jack up the prices to call your family. You work 20 hours a week, you got $20. Well, that actually only turns out to be like 20 minutes on a call. I mean, it's absolutely absurd how they, exploit these people for their labor in U.S. prison. If we're interested in sanctioning people, I think that's the place to start. Some interesting stories from Afghanistan. The UN is concerned that healthcare workers are being targeted. They counted 12 attacks from mid-March to mid-May that seem to be directed at healthcare workers. Of course, the most notable is the attack on the Doctors Without Borders maternity ward in Kabul, which resulted in that maternity ward being permanently closed. It's not often that I have 2 good news stories from Afghanistan, but apparently the Taliban and Afghan government are moving closer to actually agreeing to having talks in Qatar. This would be huge, although, still a long way from peace, but a huge step forward. Apparently one of the sticking points is there are several people on the Taliban list of prisoners they want freed that the Afghan government says is too dangerous. So far, it seems like signals from NATO partners are they agree with the Afghan government that these people are too dangerous to let leave. But, they've made progress on these prisoner swap talks in the past, and so hopefully that could continue. CENTCOM reported that U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan are at 8,600, and so we're really only back to the start of the Trump administration, but it does feel like some success, and that it is on track as far as the agreement signed between the U.S. and the Taliban to maybe actually end this. There's a complicated and interesting little quagmire going on right now in the Mediterranean Sea between France and Turkey. France attempted to inspect some Turkish ships that they believed were carrying weapons going to Libya, and those would have gone to the government and national accord, which France opposes. And they said that the Turkish ship has ignored their orders, and now Turkey has reported that the French ships are ignoring some of their orders. And I guess France reported that a Turkish ship was interfering with one of their frigates. So these are 2 NATO allies, and they're having these conflict disputes out in the Mediterranean Sea. I think it shows, one, that the NATO alliance is actually kind of fragile, and I think these are 2 countries that actually could both turn and leave and say goodbye to the alliance for good. And I think the U.S. should follow suit. the murder of an unarmed autistic Palestinian man who was apparently trying to take out his trash and then go to his like adult care program was executed by police has sparked this kind of movement in Palestine, a Palestinian Lives Matter movement. I think this is very interesting because them linking their plight to, you know, the oppressed group within the world empire, you know, seeing that at home America, you know, the you know, U.S., I guess, historically, the black people in the U.S. have received the worst treatment. I suppose, you know, maybe if you look at the past 20 years, some Muslim people or Arabs might say like, you know, it's been pretty bad for us too. So I guess not to, you know, trivialize anybody else's suffering or anything like that, but just to say that the Palestinians equating their suffering with the, you know, suffering of the black community in the United States, I think it is powerful and is able to catch on, especially because, you know, the way they suffer in Israel is so much worse, you know, than what happens here in the U.S. You know, it just is. I'm not trying to minimize anybody's suffering, to say that if people, I think, see what's going on in Israel and how bad the Palestinians have it, and they get some attention because of using this Palestinian Lives Matter slogan, well, you know, that's a great thing, and maybe it could change some minds and opinions here in the U.S. All right, the last thing I have for today's show is just to mention Yemen, where the suffering is on an unbelievable scale. Dave DeCamp has a great piece up today at antiwar.com talking about how the people are dropping like flies there of COVID and all kinds of other preventable diseases, and the Saudi bombs keep falling. This is another case where, you know, hashtag Yemeni Lives Matter, I think, powerful. If people look at, you know, pictures of Yemeni children, I think it's very obvious that, you know, these people have it about worse off than anywhere else on earth. Their children cannot eat and are starving to death and dying. You know, these are kids that are chronically malnourished, who have the large protruding belly, the arms and legs that don't look like they could support the weight of the body. And then the most shocking thing is, you know, a 7-year-old girl who is starved to death. You realize it's actually an 8-year-old girl. What else could possibly be said? So we need to find some way, I think, to capture essentially the moral outrage of the moment for these people just for a little bit of time. As I talked about in the intro, for the most part over the past 24 hours after Trump's rally in Tulsa, the news cycle has been captivated by him, you know, his crowd being small and people mocking him for that, which seems to be accurate. His crowd was small, and I'm not necessarily opposed to mocking the president for that, but that can't be all you talk about. You know what I mean? That, like, it's a fun joke, and, you know, Trump's hiding in the bunker, and let's all like have a little bit of fun about it, but it's not the biggest news story in the world, and it's not something that should consume our attention entire day. The other thing is obvious joke that Trump made. And I guess, you know, people could say like, hey, the president shouldn't be joking in the middle of an epidemic about it, but talking about slowing down tests. Now, I think what Trump did there is actually pretty brilliant, because what he's doing, calling a lot of attention to the fact that the reason that the COVID cases are so high is because they're testing so many. And so, you know, he's drawn a lot of attention to that, but at the same time, we've now been consumed by an entire day by saying that Trump actually ordered his staff to have less tests. Not that that's something that would ever happen, or, you know, it's something like Trump's not trying to kill American. That's absurd, and that people that believe that are ridiculous. And it was an obvious joke, and what it did is it ended up calling a lot of attention, partly because he's able to predict the mainstream media response to that fact. But again, this captivates us, all of the fact checkers and everything like that, and nobody takes the time and realizes the genocide going on in Yemen. At least 100,000 people have died, but we can't even begin to count and imagine the damage that's been done to that country. Somebody said that country's been bombed bad 20 years, and they, you know, did a study that showed all the infrastructure essentially, you know, 20 years ago they had the same quality they have now. What does that even mean? You know, for, I guess we go back to eating worse Domino's pizza and having flip phones instead of iPhone. I think in Yemen that means that people don't drink filtered water. Water is soil. It's contaminated, infected. It gives cholera. Bombing Yemen back 20 years, apparently bombing them back as close as Stone Age the Saudis have been able to do. It's crazy what's happened there, and it's crazy that nobody pays attention. One of the things, watching a lot of people rip down statues and taking a lot of hate and anger against Thomas Jefferson and Confederate soldiers and stuff like that. And look, I mean, I think there's a reasonable discussion to be had if Robert E. Lee's statue need to be parked across the South, something like that. And I think in a healthy society, this happens through some kind of debate and discourse and not peeling down statue. I think a lot of times what happens is that anybody who wants to rip a statue down says that represents racism. If anybody tries to say, well, that means something different, that to me, they just say, oh, haha, you vow to yourself as a racist. That's absurd. You should be able to listen to the other side of an argument, understand where people are coming, and then, be able to reach some kind of conclusion there, and not just say, we're going to go rip down the statue and everybody who's with us is a racist. But, that's kind of the standard for that right now. But they're like, what we need to do is rip down these statues. It's like, you do realize that your country in the middle of a genocide, that there's a lot worse things going on right now, and none of you could talk about it. It's crazy how little attention in any kind of. So I don't know, I've said crazy a lot, and this is probably the latest I've recorded an episode in quite some time, so maybe I was a little bit more tangential in the show, but just really spend a lot of time looking at what's going on in Yemen. It's really disgusting. It's one of those things where it's absurd at how little attention. All right, everybody, well, that's the show. Make sure you share online, Libertarian Institute. While you're there, check out the news roundup, and then subscribe to the show. It's got its own podcast feed. There's the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, so you get my show, the Scott Horton Show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, that's Pete Quinones. Keith Knight has a podcast that's on there, and then Jen the Libertarian and Tommy Solomon's and his Year One podcast. So we got a lot of great content on that feed. Make sure you check that out. On Twitter, I'm at KYAALE, and I'll be back on Wednesday.